The number one question I'm asked on a regular basis on podcasts, Instagram Lives, in my direct messages: how do I get started? Alright guys, what I want to cover in this 4-part series is the ideal weekly training split, proper exercise selection, and what types of reps and sets you should be doing if you're a trained beginner looking to get started. If this is something you plan on implementing, I would wait until the conclusion of this series so you have a little more context on how to best implement everything we're going to cover in this series. The way that we have our weekly training divided is between push and pull sessions, and then depending on your specific goals, each day has a different specific priority. Whether that's the handstand push-up, one-arm chin-up, planche, or lever. We're going to be starting out with a push day, more specifically the planche. With the planche, we're going to be working primarily scapular protraction, shoulder flexion, and hip compression. I like to start off every training session with a quick warm-up, so 5 to 10 minutes of jumping rope to get a little warm. Then I like to follow it up with my wrist routine. I've already done a full video on warming up the wrists, and I'll be sure to link that one below for you guys. Up first, we've got 4 sets of 8 seconds of the tuck planche. It's really important to make sure that these sets don't feel super difficult. While yes, we're building strength here, it's more about rehearsing perfect pattern and allowing your connective tissue, joints, and bones time to adapt to these new and challenging positions. This means by the final set, you could still hold the position for another 4 to 6 seconds, because if we push too close to failure, it can definitely screw up our training for the next day. Remember, the planche works a ton of muscles in the upper body, including the shoulder flexors, more specifically the biceps, which has the potential to interfere with our pulling exercises we have planned the next day. So instead of going to max effort, you really want to hone in on getting down perfect technique and nailing the movement. Let's take a quick look at the planche hip position, as beginners really seem to struggle with this. Ideally, we want the hips in line with the shoulders. This is going to be accomplished by scapular protraction, which is going to lift the body off the floor, as well as the shoulder flexors, more specifically the anterior deltoids and the long head of the biceps, which is going to prevent the shoulders from going into extension and the hips dropping down. The abdominals and hip flexors are going to help keep the legs lifted and the body compressed. Because this position is extremely difficult for a beginner to jump right into, I like to recommend a band with enough tension to maintain perfect technique, either around the waist, or if that's too difficult, you can place it around the ankles. What we're going to be doing for the planche is running a basic intra-exercise linear progression here. We're going to be increasing the sets and reps each week while keeping the band tension constant. In week 1, we're going to start out with 4 sets of 8-second holds, so a total of 32 seconds of time under tension. Moving on to week 2, we'll be doing 4 sets of 10-second holds, so a total of 40 seconds of time under tension. Then in week 3, we'll be hitting 5 sets of 9-second holds, which is going to be 45 seconds of time under tension. Then we're going to be rounding it out in week 4, which with 5 sets of 10-second holds, for a total of 50 seconds of time under tension. And the idea here is to progress from session to session to allow your connective tissue, joints, and bones time to adapt while rehearsing perfect technique. If you actually chose a variation that allowed 4 to 6 seconds in the tank on your final set, that's going to give us enough room to progress from session to session and not end up with any of these common overuse injuries. And after 4 weeks, you can simply go back to week 1, use a lighter band, and continue this process until you no longer need a band. After the tuck planche, we're going to move on to a superset, where we're still working the planche pattern, just an easier variation so we can focus on quality technique without overdoing it. So in my eyes, the more specific work we can get in with a pattern, the better. So with this pattern, we're going to continue to hit scapular protraction and isometric shoulder flexion. And we're choosing a variation of the planche that hits all the muscles of the upper body quite well while removing that abdominal compression component in order to focus on that mind-muscle connection. Okay, I've supersetted these planche leans with 4 sets of 10 reps of cyclic squats. That means I'm going to alternate back and forth between the 2 movements. With this push-pull split, legs are going to be considered a push movement since I'm pushing away from my center of mass, while deadlifts and hamstring curls are going to be considered a pull movement since I'm pulling towards my center of mass. I've chosen a cyclic squat here versus a traditional back or front squat because the goal is to stimulate the desired muscle group without generating too much overall fatigue. So you could definitely argue that back squats would be a better quad developer, but they're also going to require a high degree of recovery. And since we're back in the gym the next day on our pull day doing heavy chin-ups and front lever work, we don't want to overuse our spinal stabilizers in midline too much. The cyclic squat, due to the position of the feet, is going to allow our knees to track further over our toes, meaning we're working through a larger range of motion and we can use less weight to achieve the same desired effect. As you can probably tell by now, exercise selection throughout the week is super important when we're prioritizing gymnastics-based movements as our #1 goal. Up next, we're finally getting into some dynamic reps with the dip. I like the dip because we're still working the anterior delts, but whereas with the planche we were resisting shoulder extension, now we're allowing the shoulders to go into extension while simultaneously working those triceps. Dr. Brett Contreras, who you probably know as the glute guy, ran a solo EMG study, and he found for all intent purposes, the dip is an extremely well-rounded exercise for the upper body, addressing all aspects of the pecs and triceps. Now this probably begs the question, if we're trying to improve the tuck planche, why don't we choose another horizontal pushing pattern like the push-up or the bench press? And while I don't have a major issue with this, I really like the dip because the shoulder angle in the dip is slightly different in comparison to something like the bench press. So we're getting a little bit of variety at that glenohumeral joint, which can allow us to reduce the likelihood of developing some sort of pattern overload syndrome. And we're going to round out this session with supersetting those dips with a form of abdominal compression work. Because remember, pulling those knees to the chest is going to require hip or abdominal compression. And while something like L-sits would be a phenomenal gymnastics-based compression movement, by this point in time in the session, your shoulders and triceps are going to be pretty smoked, so L-sits probably aren't going to happen. It's going to be better to choose a form of abdominal compression that's not going to require your upper body. So for that reason, I really like hanging leg raise variations. And that's going to finish out this workout, just so you can see what it looks like all together. There you go. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the rest of the series. Leave a thumbs up if you like the video, and I'll see you guys here next week.